Hey guys, it's Tim here at the Townsmen. It's been a while since we've had an episode for you, but Bryce and I had a chance to sit down and talk about the role of government. Quite a bit more informal, just hanging out and having a conversation. Hope you guys find it useful in your pursuit of the truth, have some good conversations about it, and hope you enjoy it too.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. And so we've just naturally feed off each other and have those type of things and whatnot. So, but what the topic that I want to do for this one is definitely is talking about government, or really just the idea of authority in general, and really what that means. And the reason why I think that this is an important topic, especially we're just on the heels of a new election, or just got done with an election, and what 2024, and this was something that as a relatively young man, it's hard to kind of capture this, but what I heard from people, from boomers, people that have lived, much longer than we have, that have been on this earth and have seen American politics, what they have said is these past 4 to 8 years has been different.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Yeah. And to where I think what it is it's because of the situations that have been happening and whatnot has really kind of seen more polarizing effects.
For sure.
Right. It's as if the on a magnet, right? The two that oppose each other, if they're further away, you can't really feel it. But the closer and closer it gets, the more you start seeing the resistance. And so what I have seen on kind of the two ditches when it comes to government, which we'll get to the definition and origin and whatnot, but and I'm going to focus more on our demographic, just because we can speak to each other a little bit better. And I think what we want to do, especially here as the Townsmen, is we want to give guys like, hey, have you thought about this? Right, to kind of sharpen, or maybe sometimes even to dull. Like maybe they have an edge to them that probably is not beneficial or not good. And so
I think at that point, it's a little biased, seeing as this is what I do for work now, but take off those burrs.
Exactly.
It's like it's sharp, but it's not supposed to be sharp.
Right.
Yeah.
And what happens, it's right, the raw machining process, right? Sometimes people go through a very difficult situation, calluses them, hardens them, which does a lot of good, but sometimes there's some residual effects to that.
There's some scaling after a heat treat you've got to shake off and polish off, things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So we don't want to deny the part entirely just because it's got a couple burrs and edges to it.
Right. We
want to help them see the good and the edge in it. So, but kind of the two ditches that I'll see that I've been seeing with government, and really it is a view of government, a belief of how you think government should be, is, and I'll use the two L words. One is a liberal view, which ironically, liberal and liberalism used to be about detaching or liberating yourself from authorities. But really what I think what liberalism has taken shape to now is a very, I don't want to throw a lot of these buzzwords out, but communist or Marxist view, where they've adopted this view of like there is oppressor and oppressed, right? And depending on what level of oppressed you are, your whole goal in life is to attack the oppressor.
Yeah.
And what they have viewed now, I say they as categorically, is in order to fight the oppressor, which it's no longer the government actually. That used to be the view, is that government was your oppressor.
Right.
Now it's these multi-billionaire, self-made rich folks or whatever oppressor that they want to use. Now they view the government as an ally to fight,
which is
that oppressor.
Mind-boggling.
Right.
Yeah.
Failing to understand that the government is, I say the government, but those that are in authority, right? They say, sure, we'll fight your quote-unquote oppressor if you play our game.
Yeah.
Where I think on another side of the extreme is a libertarian view, to where any and all form of authority is wrong, is inherently wrong.
Yeah.
You should not have authority. You probably would hear that. Well, government was just an arbitrary thing that some man made up, and he just wants to try to hold on to it for all he's got. And I don't quite think so.
Right.
Talking about origin there, but to kind of define terms to make sure that we're all kind of hopefully on the same sheet of music, or at least a similar sheet of music.
Yep.
is how we define government and how I've defined government. And I'll say this, that I did a little bit of research, looked up Merriam-Webster dictionary, and really also just kind of looking out and seeing really just government in general. So I know we're in an American setting, but looking at other governing authorities as well. But how I've always, I shouldn't say that, how as tightly as it could be defined is all government is, it's simply the system of how a society executes justice within itself.
Yep.
Right. It's how a society will use the authority that's given to them, right, to either encourage or discourage certain behaviors or ethics, right? And so really the two main ingredients for government is authority and morality, right? So authority is basically sanctioned use of force. And sanctioned, meaning that it is justified or that it is given. And then morality obviously is the standard of justice, right? And so that is what government as its essential role is in its definition, is that it is meant to execute justice.
Okay.
Right? And so in order to actually execute justice, you need to have force. You need to have the actual means, right? It's like if a chihuahua barks at you, right? Yeah, it might scare you for a little bit, but does it really have any authority or force behind it? No. As opposed to a German Shepherd.
Right.
Right. It's got a little bit more force behind it. It can actually, and then by what standard is it judging off of? Right. And so a lot of this is found, again, being a Christian, right? I go to the scriptures, and this is where you get in Romans 13 very clearly. Romans 13 verses 1 through 6. And I do encourage everyone, read through it, what it's talking about. And to really kind of summarize it is that it says that let every person be subject to authority, right? How I read that is we're all under some authority here, right? Including government themselves, right? They're all under the supreme authority. We're all subject to a certain authority, right? And to understand that there's no authority given except that which is from God. Now, for us as Americans, that sounds, some of us be like, yeah, amen. But for other people, that's like, what are you saying that, God, has sanctioned or allows even wicked rulers to rule? In his divine providence, yes. Right. And so all authority, let's be subject to all authority, and all authority has been given by God. And that's where the whole sanctioned part comes from, is that government has got its sanction, not from man, but from God himself, right? Now, I know a lot of times we conflate of like, well, what God are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about the Creator, right? The divine Creator here. But another thing in Romans 13 where it talks about as well is that governing officials are actually ministers of the Lord. We don't really use that language anymore, especially in America. But wait, you go to England, right? What is the defense called? It's called the Ministry of Defense. You go up to Canada, they have the Ministry of Forestry. It's like just a lot of these things, but that's what it used to be seen as. It was a ministry, right? And what they are is they're actually agents of wrath, meant to execute justice on the land, like we talk about. And so that's what's very unique, is that in the biblical sense, is that government was never, it was meant to be agents of wrath, meant to execute justice, and as it says in Romans 13 as well, is that they are a terror to bad conduct, not to good conduct. So unfortunately during COVID, right, there was a split in the evangelical world of, well, in Romans 13 it says we're supposed to be subject to governing authorities, right?
Yes, but no.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because what is it a terror to? It's a terror to bad conduct and not to good conduct, right? And this is for every individual to really kind of decipher for themselves. But it's like, what is considered good conduct and what is considered bad conduct? And I think we have kind of conflated in, again, the more liberal view of, I think it's just kind of the air that we breathe in some areas, is like, yeah, we should just follow our government because they know what's best for us and what's good for us, and everything they do, we shouldn't question it. Right? As if they are God on earth, as if they are a supreme authority.
Right.
Right. But what actually happens is good simply means compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And Scripture,
Docile, yeah.
right. The Scripture doesn't talk about that, right? When you see Jesus, when he was on trial in front of Pontius Pilate, ready to be crucified, you look at him, and he actually questioned. Pontius Pilate goes, "Don't you know I have the authority to kill you?" And Jesus said, "You have no authority except which that has been given to you from my Father."
Yeah.
I mean, that's balls. It's like, this is a guy who's going to bring him to his death. And even Pontius Pilate, who was a pagan ruler, realized that they wanted to kill him out of spite. They actually had no justified reason to kill him.
Yeah.
And so it's that balance that I believe that those of the faith that we struggle with, right? Where can we and should we have some disobedience to our governing authorities for the sake of a higher good?
Yeah.
Right? Again, it's that whole balance. But to get back to what government is ultimately for and why government exists, it's to execute justice in the land. And that's why, again, by God's grace, still in the American system, although it's getting more difficult, is we can influence that and we can hold them accountable to that.
Yeah.
Where most of the time, especially in the more ancient world, right, when you read in the Old Testament, even all the way up to the New Testament times, Caesar was considered God. He was considered Lord on earth, right? Nebuchadnezzar, right? You talk about all these rulers, they saw themselves as God or as, Lord overall, right? And the Christians, the reason why they got persecuted in the first century, one of the main reasons was they said Jesus is Lord, not Caesar is Lord.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why they hated him. And they're like, come on, man, just pinch a little incense to Caesar. So, but again, the government, I think it does have a clear definition and a clearly defined role and responsibility.
Sure.
But to kind of pivot then, what is the origin of government? Where does it come from? Again, one side says, oh, it was just some arbitrary idea that some guy came up with. Or you have the other side is like, well, it's the best thing since sliced bread, and we should just, be compliant, be docile just to get along, and, all that stuff. But what I've found, you go back to the Scriptures, and it says in Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. The whole by man part, that's the primary importance, is that whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall he be judged, right? Basically what God did is God gave man the responsibility to govern himself. And you think about it, this is written in Genesis right after the flood. This is before the Ten Commandments, this is before Leviticus and whatnot. But God bestowed responsibility for man to self-govern in doing so. And what I was taught is that is really the origin of government. And what's kind of interesting is the imagery of the rainbow. This is something that I was taught as well.
Yeah.
Is
what the rainbow's supposed to mean.
Correct. Which when we start actually talking about it, you'll see how ironic it is.
Yep.
And what the rainbow signifies, when God says that I will put a rainbow in the clouds for you as a reminder that I will not judge you with water, by the way. He says he will still judge you with fire and other stuff. But what it signifies is that before the flood, what God would do is God would directly judge and govern man himself, right? If you will, he would have more of a direct relation. But after the flood, and he gave man the responsibility to self-govern, the weapon that he used, which again, to kind of backtrack a little bit, the definition, right, found in Romans 13, is that they're agents of wrath, meant to execute justice, that they don't bear the sword in vain.
Yeah.
The sword has always been seen as a tool of justice, right? And you can see that in pictures. You can see that, really everywhere. You see that. Nowadays, we would kind of equate that more of like a rifle or something.
Yeah.
But the sword was kind of seen as like that was the tool of justice. And again, in Romans, it talks about that we're agents, that government agents of wrath execute justice, and that they do not bear the sword in vain. Meaning that they do bear the sword, right? But they should not be doing it for vain intentions, which is why what Christ did, when you read in the New Testament, how he interacted with soldiers is very unique.
Yeah.
He never condemned them for their jobs, but rather he said, you take the wages that is rightfully yours.
Mm-hmm.
Again, also Romans 13, it talks about paying taxes because they're ministers, right? It's good that they get their fair wage, and that you do not abuse the authority that's been given to you. That's what Christ always talked about to soldiers when we read in the New Testament. So rather interesting. But to get back to it, the rainbow was seen as like a bow and arrow. And what God does, because this is still a reality that we live under today, is that when we see the rainbow, it's supposed to remind us this, is that what God did is God laid down the weapon that he was using to judge man in the clouds as a reminder that you have a responsibility to govern yourself. That you know the laws, they're written on your heart, right?
Yep.
You have the 10 Commandments. You know, and really you talk to anyone who's even irreligious, right? If somebody steals from them, what do they want? They want justice, right? Because they know they've been wronged.
Yeah.
Right. There is that sense. And so that symbology of the rainbow, it's always been fascinating to me. And it's still to this day. This is a reality that we live under, that God laid down the tool that he used to judge man. And he says, man, you are responsible to govern yourself. Right. And that's what the sword is. So it's kind of ironic that there has been a group in the society that has hijacked the rainbow.
Yeah.
Basically saying that you cannot judge us and you should not judge us.
Yeah.
When in the same vein, that rainbow is supposed to be a reminder for us to judge accordingly to the scriptures. Or judge accordingly.
I think that is entirely the purpose of the modern understanding of the rainbow. Is it's supposed to be everything that built this country and that the beliefs and everything behind it are being put on their head for the sake of destroying it.
Yeah.
It's outright their purpose. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they are doing. You look at anything that the quote-unquote woke are doing, it's worded very, very similarly to any creed or any prayer or something like that in the Christian faith.
Yep.
But flipped over. It's meant to be an exact dialectical opposite of creation.
Yep.
It is only meant to destroy, cause chaos, all of these kinds of things.
Yep.
And going back to an old episode about chaos, I think it proves the authority of God. It's like you can try to be as chaotic as you want to. It's like this has a orderly outcome. We just don't see it yet.
Yeah.
So those things always come to order, and then if people aren't doing their job, if people do not subordinate themselves to a higher order, then we, often accidentally, but I think now it's often purposeful, destroy that whole thing.
Yeah.
The whole thing just decays.
Yeah.
But it'll decay into its original pieces that people will, hopefully, if they're diligent and properly well educated, not, through a university necessarily, but they're able to do their own homework, do their own research, all of these things.
Yeah.
You need a well-informed public.
Yes.
Which is a really hard thing to get when everything is pretty much pushing against you. Society is swung. The secret fourth arm of the government is the media, for those that don't know.
Yep.
That's in full force against the things that created it and allowed it to exist.
Yep.
So, what is the government? Well, when it's operating well is what we're talking about.
Right.
I think what we're seeing is when it doesn't operate well.
Yeah. Yeah. And not to get too much into kind of contemporary analyzing of what we're seeing in the modern times, but a short video that I really on the Wade Show talked about that there's actually been basically 5 republics in America. You had the first republic, which was actually the Articles of Confederation, where they found that what they were trying to balance is what is the least amount of government necessary for a functioning society.
Right.
They found out that, and what I would say, I've actually had, being down in Oklahoma for a couple of years, you kind of get a little bit of a liberal bug, or not a liberal, you get kind of a freedom bug in you, where somebody suggested to me, what is a good thing to do is to read the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution to really kind of get the view of both sides of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists.
Yeah.
Which I think I didn't do a very good job. Reading the Constitution is kind of should be the baseline that you start out with, and not to put labels on myself, but I would consider myself more of a Federalist, at least in the purest sense of what they were trying to achieve.
Yep.
However, though, the Articles of Confederation had a lot of very good points, and it warned us of a route that could go down, which surprisingly, this is in the Wade Show, it talks about that, is that there's never going to be a perfect form of government. They're always going to have some sort of, allowance for maybe some form of tyranny. And to kind of fast forward a little bit, when you get to the Civil War, before the Civil War, people used to define the United States as the United States are. It's like we are a confederation of states with their own unique cultures, and even down to the state level, different governments, different ways of doing business. And what the Federalists were trying to balance is, how can we have the states be as independent as possible, and yet for the sake of commerce, for the sake of really just efficiency, what is, and also checks and balances as well. It's like, what is a right balance between allowing the states to be able to operate independently while at the same time we have some sort of unification within us.
Yeah.
But then after the Civil War, the definition is the United States is, right? There's now more of a homogeny to the United States in that degree.
That's why literally it was the Union versus the Confederates. It's like, do we want to be one, or do we want to be, federal?
Yeah, which, no less, that is a rather really intriguing question, right? Because being down in Oklahoma for a few years, which again, Oklahoma didn't become a state till actually years after the Civil War.
Quite a long time.
Yeah, they were seen as the Wild West still, and they still are the Wild West to a degree. You talk to any Oklahoman,
it's in them.
It's in them for sure, which I appreciate, by the way.
Absolutely.
Stay free, boys. Stay free. But they said one view of that is it was Northern oppression, where they were trying to impose certain things on it. And that got me thinking of that is a good question. Because, this is the balance that I was trying to figure out, is this. If you know that your neighbor is doing something that is, quite frank, that is morally wrong, right? To enslave another human being when you're made in the image of God, right? There is no human being that is greater than one another in terms of value, because we're all made in God's image. Now, there are hierarchies, of course, right? The man is the head of the household. The hierarchies are built in.
Yeah.
They're built into nature, right? Which, what you were kind of talking about, the more you fight nature, the more nature's probably going to win.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of working with nature, and this is more also on a spiritual level too, the supernatural, working with the supernatural rather than trying to fight against it. Anyways, to kind of get back to the train of thought, is if your neighbor is doing something morally wrong, right, and they're not willing to give it up, how do you engage that? Because there's something innate within us, is that we should call to justice, injustices for sure. But at the same time, are you allowed to use force? And this is where it really gets into kind of what we're going to talk about next, of the divine institutions and what their roles and responsibility are. Because again, government is meant to execute justice in the land, right? So they bear the sword, and they are there to impose justice as needed. But when there is a moral wrong that is being occurred, right, should government always be the one stepping in, always executing, quote, justice? The question is, but what do you mean by justice, right? If you're going 5 miles over the speed limit, did they have the justification to pull you over and to execute you? That seems like a bit extreme, right?
Yeah.
Or if you have, millions and millions and millions of babies being slaughtered in the womb because they're not needed and they're unwanted, right? But we can just brush that off. It's pro-choice. It's like, hold on. What it sounds like is that the scales of justice, which again, that symbol of blind lady justice, it's very important actually, is that it's supposed to be blind as it's supposed to be impartial, and that the scales are supposed to be evenly balanced. And I think what we have is uneven scales and balances right now.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and so we need to get back, pray for revival and reform in our lands, first with us, and then hopefully extended forward. But to kind of get to then, all right, we're talking about government, kind of got hopefully a good enough definition of what it is, kind of the origin, where it's from. How does this all play together?
Hope you're enjoying the episode. Thought we'd just take a break here and do a little self-advertisement. If you guys are enjoying the podcast, enjoying this episode, and want to help support us, we have some merch for sale in our Discord server. Pretty cool t-shirts, some caps, some other stuff. If you guys are interested in any of that, jump right on in. You can jump in on our speakeasies on Saturdays at 8 p.m. Central. Check out our list of merch, and then message me there if you guys want anything. Let's get back to it.
And what I was taught in college, actually through Valor, which was the crew Bible study for cadets and midshipmen. We went through a quick mini series about government because if you're about to enter into the government, into the military, right, you are part of that ministry now, if you will, or that institution. And the pastor, who was a great pastor, good Southern Baptist guy, I forgot what his name is, he talked about that there are 3 divine institutions on this land. You have, first one is the family. This is straight in Genesis 1, let us make man in our image, male and female. He created Adam, then he created Eve, and by extension you have family, which is the center of society. It's not the individual. It's actually family that is the center of society. Now, individuals have a role and responsibility, of course, but society is built around families.
Right.
And really, family is kind of that microcosm of the world, of reality. Economy in the Greek actually means house rule or house law. So take that for what it is. But the next one you have is the church, which is God's elect or God's chosen people. And what you find again is you find this in Genesis. You have Cain and Abel. Right? Abel gave a worthy sacrifice and Cain did not. Right? And when you read in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, where it says that Abel, by faith, gave a worthy sacrifice, and that when he died, his blood was still speaking. How I read that and understand that is that by faith, Abel was justified. By grace you've been saved through faith. And so it's again, you find it right in Genesis. And then when we talked about the origin, you'll see government. And what I mean by divine institution is that it's God ordained institution, right? Which is a system and has a certain role and responsibility. And so again, we can expand out of this a lot, right? How do these 3 play into each other? And kind of the two things I want to bring up, because I get a sense that we're kind of on the tail end of one view of how these 3 institutions should interact with each other.
Yeah, I would say we're reaching the end of postmodernism. Yeah. And doing something else after that. Yeah,
which interestingly, the Reformation came out of kind of a similar era. Anyways, I don't want to go all the way back to, Adam and Eve kind of deal, but was a very prominent view in the West was a medieval thought was that the church is over the state. This is where basically the Pope he is seen as the authority of Jesus on earth. And really this is where he got the idea of papal states, where he had the idea of divine authorities, and then you had secular authorities. And that language that you hear, we don't really hear that too often. But the reason why I think this is important is because in the medieval thought, right, the church was over the state. Basically what happened is that then gave the church the sword, which again, the church should not have the sword in the sense of an actual sword, although I won't get into the Second Amendment and all that stuff quite yet. But it was meant as that the government was supposed to be a third-party entity that was actually supposed to also hold the people, the family, and actually the church. There's a balance between all of them. But when you have one over the other, right, it's going to abuse its authority, right? This is where you got the murdering of heretics. This is where you got certain laws and certain ways of doing business that, quite frankly, gave the church ultimate authority and failed to remind itself that it was also held under, it didn't speak on behalf of God, right? And that's actually the scriptures. So what happened is you had the Renaissance, which the Renaissance was the view of trying to get back to origins, get back to original thought, and a lot of good came out of the Renaissance, and the Reformation came out of the Renaissance. But what happened is I think there was more of a humanist, modernist, now what we know as postmodernist thought, to where, no, the church is not over the state, the church shouldn't be over the state. But I think what happened is it kind of did a 180 and the state became over the church.
Right.
And this is what the reformers kind of came out of had to battle as well, is the church was slowly losing its authority, its strict authority over the state as it used to have, because reformers would brought up as like, no, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing as the church. Right. And then likewise, the state then kind of saw the vacuum, kind of took over, and then they started doing what they used to do, which was, we are God on earth. And this is where, again, the modernist thought is that man or humans are the ultimate source of truth, right? Completely kind of detaching themselves from God. Postmodernist thought is that the individual is the ultimate source of truth, and all of that. And so this is, I think, kind of the era that we have seen is still kind of a secular modernist thought of that the church should be subordinate to the state in a lot of things as well, and should be complying. This is what you saw in 2020. And I bring this up all the time because it's true. Is what happened is the state violated your First Amendment right underneath your nose, and you didn't even know it.
Yeah.
Or maybe you did know it, but you were taught to not fight it. Right? The whole idea of peaceably assembling, it's not just for protests.
Yeah.
The right to peaceably assemble is the right to actually worship.
Yeah.
It's because they also read in the First Amendment too that we will have no established religion. That is actually no established federal religion, right? Again, it goes back to preventing the medieval church idea of that the church will be over the state.
Right.
Now, ironically, you can have state-run churches. Even in the Constitution, that is allowed. You will never have a federal-run church, but you can have state-run churches, and they were. They existed, but they found out is that is a death blow to any denomination.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting when you see that. And so the humanist thought, but an idea that I heard a few years ago, and I've only done a little bit of research, but it seems to make sense. Abraham Kuyper, he was a Dutch reformer. He coined the term what's known as sphere sovereignty, to where he says that these three divine institutions, it's not quite the language that he used, but these institutions, they all have their respective roles and responsibility. Now, he didn't say that they're all independent of each other and operate independently. There is overlap, right? I'll give you a quick example. In Leviticus, we'll start with Samuel. Samuel was a prophet, priest, and Israel wanted to have a king. They wanted to have a king just like every other nation. Samuel said, why do you need a king? You already have a king. That for what it is. But what he said, and God actually told Samuel, is give them a king. I won't go the reason why I think God said that, but he wanted to give him a king. So what Samuel did is Samuel first warned the people of what a king will do. And it's prophetic. It's obviously prophetic. It's in the scriptures where it says what the king will do is he will take your land. He will take your sons and send them to wars to die, right? He will take all your property. Like all of those things that what we read in our Constitution is to prevent the federal government from doing, right? Essentially what Samuel did is Samuel wrote down all the warnings to the people saying, if you want a king, this is what's going to happen. And then he actually wrote a constitution. He basically wrote and said that this is the responsibilities that your king, the king of Israel, will have. And when a king was going to be anointed or inaugurated into Israel, what a king first had to do is he had to rewrite all of the Levitical laws in front of a Levitical priest to make sure he's not fudging anything, and that he had to recite them every day as a reminder that the authority that you're wielding is not from you. And this is where I think this is an extension of what the church ought to be doing. Is like John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, right? He called out, it wasn't Nero, I was trying to remember who, right? Basically saying that you cannot have your son's wife, right? What he was doing is he was holding governing authorities, responsible to the ultimate authority. And that's where the church is the salt and the light. Salt, preservers of truth, right? You have the scriptures, you have the truth, right? And as God's elect, we're supposed to be the truth bearer, and then the light, the hope, and to see God's blessing through his people, kind of ordeal as well. And so with the sphere sovereignty idea is that government has its certain role and responsibility. Again, execute justice as a third party, right? It's supposed to be that unbiased third party that if a crime occurs, they are meant to judge fairly, to judge rightly, regardless of economic status, social status, all of that stuff, to judge fairly, accordingly, and then to execute justice, right? Rather than what we see now is, people that have multiple offenses is being scot-free. But if this is going to be spicy. But if you decide to walk into the Capitol on a certain day after January 5th, but before January 7th, you should be imprisoned for a few years because you're a bad boy, right? Again, the scales aren't working right. I think Lady Justice kind of has one eye poking through her blind there.
For sure.
Right? And so, but who's supposed to hold them accountable?
Yeah.
This is where, again, the church and I think a constitution, which to kind of circle back a little bit, is the type of republic that we have now is known as an administrative republic or a regulatory republic, where we have a shadow government of unelected officials, right? Experts in departments that are making laws and regulations, again, that have not gone through any process,
legal process,
right? And they're not held accountable either, right? Because they're seen above the law, right? What happened is we're living in an administrative state, which it sounds a lot like 1984, right? And so because of that reason, right, they're able to operate independently and they're able to impose a lot of rules and regulations without going through the process because they wanted to bypass the process that was meant to hold it accountable and keep it in check. Right. The reason why our founding fathers, I think rightly so, is in order for something to become a law, it had to go through an arduous process first to get vetted and to get validated. But nowadays we have a shadow government, if you will, of quote-unquote experts and officials, right, that are not elected, quite frankly, not held accountable to anything, right, and they make laws essentially by regulations, and Lord willing, I hope there's a lot of deregulation in the next few years, or at least shaking the tree and exposing things to people and realizing, they are not operating the way they ought to, right. But again, kind of get back the sphere sovereignty. It's a rather intriguing idea to me because I think it hits the right balance of the church should not be over the state because it's not the church's responsibility. The government is also held responsible to God. You don't need the church to be in between that. Likewise, the state should not be over the church, right? Because guess what? Your government makes a terrible religion. It is a terrible God. It's an idol, right? And then, of course, the family as well, too. In both of those situations, the family is the one that usually gets most of the brunt, right? Again, 1984, right? Families were not a thing. Brave New World, families were not a thing. And I believe this is that Satan, the first thing he's going to do is attack the family. How do we know that? What did he do? He tempted Adam and Eve. He wanted to break the family right there. And he did, but ultimately he doesn't get the final say. Christ has the final say. So I know it's a bit of a nutshell. Probably been going at this for a while, but just wanted this to be a bit of a primer. Now it's been a while since we've done this. hopefully this will get people thinking a little bit more, because the main thing I want to bring up is this. Well, not to bring up. The main thing I want to close is this.
Mm-hmm.
Your view of government, your belief of government, really dictates how you're going to interact with government.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Government is downstream of culture. Culture is downstream of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So religion is really kind of that center core. All
Yeah.
right. What is the belief system of our time, and what is your belief system? And that is going to impact how you interact with your government,
Mm-hmm.
whatever government you live in.
Yeah.
You know. And so my hope and my prayer is that you think about this.
Yep.
And you think about this, importantly, especially as men.
Absolutely.
Because if there's going to be one group of people that are going to hold the government accountable,
It's got to be us.
it should be men that are willing to speak up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like John the Baptist. He was willing, he knew he was going to get beheaded for this.
Yep.
But he was willing to stand up for it.
Yep.
And there are many other men in history that we can see that as an example.
Yeah. Absolutely. So be diligent, pay attention,
Mm-hmm.
and think about it very carefully. Figure out where your line is of, if this happens, we're not doing it.
Yeah.
You have a duty to your family, to yourself, to God, to the country,
Mm-hmm.
to be civilly disobedient when immoral things become law.
Yep.
That is your job. It's not someone that just joins the military's job to defend this country and the Constitution and all of the things I talked about. It is any man. You turn 18 years old, guess what your new job is? It's like, you might be doing business, you might be doing, whatever career you pursue is different than your sole responsibility as a man in this country, created in God's image.
Yeah.
And this is getting off maybe on a little bit of a side road, we'll say, but I think for a long time Christians have been told that everything should be done in peace and love, and that necessarily correlates, because I think those first two things are true.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that correlates to similarly to what we were talking about earlier, as being docile and being compliant.
Yeah.
No, you have a duty to be non-compliant. Your orders come from higher than the people that can actually tell them to you.
Yep.
And you can't disobey those things, or you get to places like we are right now.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to say, even while you're talking about it, Bryce,
Yeah.
The government did this and it took liberties away from the church. It's like, yeah, but where did the church mess up? What room did they leave for that gap to be filled? And the government took it.
Yep.
The government shouldn't have taken it, but I would argue the church to some degree shouldn't have offered it. And it wasn't like they consciously did that necessarily, but there was some kind of thing in there, and I don't know exactly what it was, that wasn't done as well as it could have been done, that if they would have been able to back it up, I don't think we would be where we are.
Yes.
And, I think there's a lot of hope in Americans, but I think for a long time, I think you see older generations have been afforded pretty easy times and good times. And as the saying goes, I won't say the whole thing, but just summarize it there, is that good times make weak men.
Yeah.
Guys our age and younger than us have been given bad times.
Yeah.
So it is our role and responsibility as men in our age and our time to step up.
Yeah.
You need to know what's going on. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to watch the news. I would highly suggest against it. But you do need to know what's going on. You need to look. You need to have conversations with people that you actually trust. And you need to ultimately subordinate yourself to that highest order. And the highest order, again, is not the government. You need to subordinate yourself to God.
Yep.
Because if you don't do that, you get everything that we've gotten now.
Yeah.
None of these big government things that are going wrong start with big government things. They start with the individual not getting their shit together.
Yep.
So get your stuff together and pay attention and be ready, because a time is likely or possible to come when it's now your job to be the guy in a history book standing up for what you believe in.
Yeah.
I think even I've allowed myself some comfort of some detachment from the times in history, whether in small pockets in American history or in other countries, when they fell away from what some of their fundamentals were. And I think we as Americans have seen a separation between what the founding fathers had intended and where we're at now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a slow, similar like that saying of putting a lobster in boiling water or a frog or whatever it is. You have to start at a normal temperature it's used to and slowly raise it, because that's how you kill it. If you start too hot and you throw something in, it's just going to jump right out.
Yeah.
I think I don't want to be alarmist in any degree, but I think we're nearing that boiling point.
Yeah.
And anyone that's young enough that hasn't just gotten used to this, or you're vigilant and you're, as some people say, you're black-pilled, like everything's hopeless, everything's whatever. It's like, no, there is hope here, because humans are not a static thing. Yeah. We are not what postmodernists have called us. There is no victim-oppressor dichotomy. We are human beings. We can become something more. We can allow the gift that Christ gave us and be able to change and be able to grow.
Yeah.
And once you know that, you're not doomed to the system. You're not doomed to whatever things you think are oppressing you. You get to stand up.
Yeah.
But it is your job as a man, as an American, to be vigilant and be ready.
Yeah. You are the militia. That's something that has stuck with me, even as when I was serving in the military. It's just, you, American, you are the militia.
Mm-hmm.
When you read the Second Amendment, it's not talking about National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
It's not talking about police. It's not talking about our military. It's talking about you.
Mm-hmm.
That you are the necessary ingredient for a free state. You can have a secure state.
Right. We have that.
Yes, but we want a free state, right? Yeah. And I think it's not about being alarmist. It's about being vigilant. About knowing the times that we're in. Kind of the picture that I was thinking about, the whole boiling water thing with the frog in there. How do you get the frog out? Sometimes you take the frog right out of the pot, and he's going to get a lot of cold shock. It's going to be a very jarring experience, but eventually he's going to warm back up and realize, all right, I'll be okay.
Yep.
Ideally, you want to turn off the boiler and let it calm down.
Yeah.
But I've also heard this as well, and it's just true. You always drift left. And I'm talking about philosophically, ideologically speaking.
Yep.
It's always a fight to the right.
Yeah.
It's always a fight to the right.
Yep.
And so a lot of times it might seem like an uphill battle, but what I encourage, just like what you're doing as well, is start the fight somewhere, start fighting uphill, and it does start ultimately with you.
Yep.
Especially for young men, it's very easy, like, what am I going to die for? What am I willing to die for?
Yep.
And what I would say, that's actually an easy thing to think. Because for some reason, men, we don't fear death. We do, but we don't.
Right.
As
long as we die for some sort of cause that we believe in, death is,
but of course,
a step in that.
Yeah. But what I would encourage you is, like, what are you willing to live for? What are you willing to be civilly disobedient about?
Yeah.
Hey, the government says you should take Flintstones multivitamins because it's good for your health. Screw you, I'm going to eat things that I grow out of my backyard. Hey, the government says you shouldn't own this type of car because it pollutes the system. Screw you, I have 10 children. I need to have an SUV that can carry all of them to church.
Right.
And the flag that's always stuck with me is it's a Revolutionary War flag. It's called Appeal to Heaven. It's just got a tree on it. It's a very simple thing, but it says Appeal to Heaven. And that symbology has always stuck with me. It was that when I do things, and I pray that I do things for the right reasons, for the noblest reasons, and kind of what you said is that the state should recognize, and you, the individual, and the family should recognize that you're under the authority of God, that you have an ultimate authority. And what I would say, and to kind of get back to the whole COVID thing, is the church also abandoned its ultimate authority as well. What gave the state room to do that was you had pastors that cared more about clicks
Mm-hmm.
on their sermons, about
Yep.
getting people in the doors to drink their coffee,
Mm-hmm. And
all-
their Kool-Aid.
and their Kool-Aid, right? Of this soft form of evangelicalism
Mm-hmm.
that it's appealing, and not to get too much into another diatribe of kind of examining how we grew up,
Mm-hmm.
but the reason why that type of church is appealing is because it came from a boomer generation that was fed a lot of traditionalism
Mm-hmm.
and tradition. Like, you just follow tradition. Well, why do I have to follow tradition? Because it's tradition. You don't question tradition.
Right.
And so what they were looking for is they wanted to find some authentic, real, raw,
Yeah.
right? But what you have to understand with that, it was a show that was meant to conjure up emotions. And I think what we have conflated is that anything that's emotional
Mm-hmm.
is real.
Yeah.
It's like, no, not inherently.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's this pendulum back and forth a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would also encourage is, man, especially if you're a person of faith,
Mm-hmm.
find a church that preaches the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you don't agree with everything that they do, right, that is your family, right? Like, when it comes to government, right, what we're trying to find is, what is the least evil government, right? We're trying to we're trying to make it as least wicked as possible.
Yeah, the lesser of two evils.
Yes.
Yeah.
While for church, what do you normally try to find? The most orthodox, the most holy, the most pure, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay, but just understand that you're never going to find a perfect church.
Yeah, and I think the disagreements you have are sort of a gift.
Yes.
Because if you agreed with everything, you'd never have to think about it. You'd
Absolutely.
never have to own it.
Yeah. I'll say this just because it's funny, and I know it conjures up. I think it's funny, maybe not to some, but you know who the first Protestant was? Paul. You know why? In Roman Catholic tradition, Peter was the first pope. When you read in Acts, Paul opposed Peter. So I guess that makes Paul the first Protestant.
Yep.
I kid, all right? Don't get your all panties in a bunch. But what I was saying is this, and even Paul talks about this, that him and Ananias, I think it was Ananias or one of them, they had a very sharp disagreement, and they both went their own ways. Well, come to find out, the way that Ananias went, he preached the gospel, started churches, he grew the church there. Paul went the other way, he preached, he built the church, and it grew there. And what Paul reflecting is that even amongst that disagreement, that sharp disagreement, and it's okay. Like, Paedo Baptists, Credo Baptists, can we sprinkle babies, or should we submerge adults for, that is a distinction. To a degree where sometimes if you're not comfortable going to a church that has one of those two practices, that's okay. Right? That should not divide the church, but it can be a distinction, just like the hand is distinct from the foot, right? As the scriptures say. But like you said, those disagreements are sometimes a blessing, because what does it do? It challenges your paradigms and your status quo.
Yeah.
And I think even I'm pretty sure there's a lot of these mega churches too that even were like, we did COVID quite successfully because we have a bunch of online viewership. It's like, you're not understanding what the church is.
Yeah.
The church is meant to be the congregation and the gathering of the family together. Right? Not about getting clicks and views, not about making people just feel good, although it's nice to have, right? The church has a clear role and responsibility. It is to rightly order the sacraments, rightly administer the sacraments, and it is to care for the flock.
Yeah.
Can you really care for the flock when they're just watching you online while they're sitting in their probably house, quite frankly, probably depressed, and trying to find some glimmer of hope?
Yeah.
And so I agree. And again, that's why I think this topic will branch out into
we're going to have more to come from this.
Plenty of others. And but that's what we're all about, is we want to continue the discussion, sharpen areas where we need, maybe knock off a few edges here too. And if we say something that you disagree with, saying, if government's under the authority of God, right, but separation of church and state, and I think you're wrong. Great. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Help me help you. Help me help you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, kind of transitioning out of here, a great way to do that jump in our speakeasies every Saturday, 8 p.m. Central. We've got a couple other events here and there. You'd have to be in the Discord to know what they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, we get into some really good stuff in there. Yeah. So no one agrees all the time.
Yeah.
We've all got our disagreements. We're individuals. We're supposed to be talking about these things. That's why the First Amendment is number one.
Yeah.
It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it can be tough. Yeah, I'll be honest.
It can be pretty grueling. Some guys get dogged on pretty good.
Yeah.
Myself included. I say something that's dumb or, not quite as well
guilty as charged
articulated as it needs to be.
Yeah.
But jump on in. We've got a link, I think, in the channel someplace, and we'll have it in the description.
Yeah.
A couple questions to answer before you're allowed really into the whole thing. But, come say hi. Come check it out. Yeah. Anybody and everyone's welcome. Be civil. But
or if you already have a group of guys that you're already doing something like this, and we maybe sparked a conversation you can have with your buddies, great.
Absolutely.
Right. It's not really a movement that we're trying to get everybody on board with us, but it's continuing the conversation.
Right.
Expanding it out. So, well, thanks for listening. We do hope that you guys found this episode helpful on government in particular. It's a very broad topic. It can be very spicy too sometimes, and can get pretty heated.
For sure.
As we saw. But we do hope that you found this useful and helpful. And if you find it helpful and you want to share it with people, go right ahead. We're all about starting the conversation.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Tim.
And I'm Bryce.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.